Thank you for coming, everyone. Today, as Dr. Linchovsky said, I'm going to be discussing Indian naval strategy. And just to give you a brief overview, first I'm going to talk about their potential as a sea power, and then how they will approach sea power, and then finally the final theme will be U.S. policy towards them. So just as a brief introduction, India is the fourth largest economy in the world and has been sustaining about a 7% growth rate every year. In addition to that, it has a very large population at 1.2 billion people, and it's estimated that somewhere by mid-century, it will surpass China as the world's largest population. And geographically, it's a little over a third the size of the continental United States. So it's a very significant regional power in South Asia. And as I'll discuss, they're looking increasingly towards the sea for their national security. So for a long time, India had been predominantly a land power, and before that, it was a colony of Great Britain. So this will be the first time in the modern world that we've seen a sea going in India. Over the past Over the past few years, it's been undergoing a military modernization, and specifically bolstering its naval capabilities. So it has a goal right now of about a 200 active ship navy by 2027, and it's specifically looking to increase its nuclear-powered submarine fleet. It currently is leasing one nuclear-powered attack submarine from Russia, and it's looking to build more domestically. It also, I believe, its ballistic missile submarine completed trials, and their goal is to have about 6 total over the next 20 years or so. So they're looking to increase both their capabilities for the attack submarines and then the increased deterrence that ballistic missile submarines can bring. And India is shifting towards the sea mainly for these 3 chief reasons. Overseas trade is an important one since it is the world's 4th largest importer of energy. So its economy is reliant on this energy in order to continue to grow. And this makes it a little bit of a weakness for it because it raises the potential that an adversary could block this energy or hinder it in some way. So it feels a vulnerability there that it's going to try to counter at sea. Concern over Chinese naval activity, specifically in the South China Sea with their claim of territorial waters and militarization of islands. And then China also has a lot of interest in the Indian Ocean, specifically the port of Gwadar. It's been investing in a lot, and it's part of the Chinese strategy of one belt, one way for its own energy resources. So India doesn't see that as necessarily a pressing threat, but it is something that gives them concern. Regional leadership is my third thing, and it's not quite as poignant as the other two, but India would like to become the leading power of South Asia and increase its political influence and also its involvement in security matters. And a navy is essential for it to pursue those interests. Okay, so now the first section, which is India's potential as a sea power. So this is drawing from a lot of the thinking of Alfred Thayer Mahan, and he points to the propensity of countries to trade as one of the key factors in developing sea power, because once you start trading and you have trade networks, you also have to protect that trade. So this is a factor that can take a predominantly land power and kind of draw them out into the sea. Another large geographic advantage that India has that Mahan talked about is the centrality of positions. So from the map here, it's a large country, and it sits astride the main Indian Ocean trade routes, and this gives it the position in the world to be advantageous for developing and then employing its sea power. It also has a coastline that enables it to move ships quickly from one side to the other, which Mahan talks about as essential for consolidating fleets. And then also, just as touched on a few times, its large size and population is a key factor. And that's part of what drew me to this topic. India is a potential great power, and the fact that it's investing heavily in its navy is significant for U.S. national security and world security. The next advantage that India has, it has several deep water ports along both coasts that will allow it to have sheltered ports for both navy and then continuing with its trade. And now the two most significant disadvantages that India has, and this comes directly out of Mahan's thinking. The first is a popular government, and the second is a continental mindset. So, speaking specifically about Indian and popular government, so Mahan argues that popular governments tend to have difficulty in maintaining navies due to their expense without clear benefits. The problem is, especially in a country like a democracy, resources tend to be shifted where the public wants them, and rarely do publics want larger navies unless there's a clear threat coming from the sea. So countries like Britain, obviously the United States, have overcome that, but with difficulty. Mahan talks specifically about Britain and how it often lagged behind in its fleets because of this propensity to cut costs for the Navy in exchange for other policies. Speaking specifically of India, the Indian population tends to shun great power politics, and they're very domestically minded. So they don't traditionally think of themselves or their country as a great power that would deploy a navy and have overseas interests. They tend to be focused predominantly on the subcontinent as far as their view of the world, and that's the third point, their internal focus. So they see themselves as the South Asian power, but they don't necessarily view India as a power like Great Britain was that would employ a large navy and use it in the world. Further on here, for the continental mindset, he points to the necessity of defending land borders. And he specifically uses France and the Netherlands as examples. When a country allocates resources to deal with threats, the land threats almost always take the precedence. And then also countries that have to contend with land threats will kind of be distracted away from the sea by adventures, he says, like France in what was the German states. So yeah, India suffers from that to some extent. Historically, threats have come toward India from the Iranian plateau, through the Indus Valley where Pakistan sits. And the rulers of India, for the majority of its history, have focused on ruling the subcontinent. And if they can do that, that is their kind of primary goal. India hasn't extended beyond the subcontinent for its own territory. Pakistan, in the modern world, is probably the most significant geopolitical threat India faces, and it predominates a lot of its strategic thinking. And the roots of this conflict are deeper than just two states that oppose each other, since the cultures of Pakistan and India are incredibly similar, yet once they were formed, the two states developed incredibly different cultures in how they viewed themselves. And that has led to an ongoing conflict that usually expresses itself over water rights or the Kashmir region. So just to summarize Indian advantages and disadvantages for developing naval power, its geographic size, location, and available ports will enable it, whereas its inward-looking culture, popular government, and its continental mindset will inhibit its development of its navy over time. So now that it's kind of been established that it's a large country with a large GDP and population that could become a major naval power, the question becomes, what type of naval power is it likely to become? Okay, India does have a maritime history. It is predominantly during the old Silk Road era of the Chinese trade network. But by the 15th century, it had been ousted as a main trading force. And then in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, it was colonized. The Indian Ocean was controlled by European powers, and that's when India was colonized. So this raises a challenge for anyone trying to discern what type of navy India will employ, because there's very little modern precedent for how they will behave at sea. So we have to look a little bit to two sea powers that have influenced it, and this is based on Indians' own statements on sea power. Great Britain would be the first. Great Britain had a lot of impact on Indian strategic thinking, and Great Britain was a global forward deployed navy, so they maintained permanent bases with forces throughout the world with it and global interests and reach. The problem is that, especially for a developing regional navy, that's not a very good fit for the strategic doctrine they're going to have to employ. So this comes from James Holmes from the Naval War College, and he argues that the American Monroe Doctrine, and especially from its early iteration all the way up into its later stages, would provide the analytical framework to understand India's naval approach, in addition to being a precedent that they themselves are going to look to. So we'll go to that in a sec, but the British influence on India was predominantly the choke points to maintain control of the Indian Ocean, and Suez, Malacca, and Bab el Mandab are the most significant in its area, and these are the number one both energy and global trade choke points that traverse the Indian Ocean. So the idea is, if you can project power and control those choke points, you control trade in the region, and by doing so, you control the sea, the way Julian Corbett kind of said that command of the sea is more the command of trade and the ability to deny others access to those routes. So that is the main strategic kind of grant that the British gave to India. In addition, Indians grew accustomed to a foreign naval power securing maritime security, and this was both America and Great Britain. After independence, it was Great Britain, and then as America took over as the world's global navy, that also continued. So, and that's for a while. India has been content to allow the American Navy to secure its sea lines of communication, and it hasn't yet built a navy to protect them itself. So now for the American influence, and I'm borrowing this from James Holmes, the 19th century American diplomacy is a better fit for India, and he lists these categories for why. Intellectual nimbleness refers to India's ability to take strategic concepts from other peoples and apply them for themselves. So they're not locked into one strategic viewpoint that is uniquely Indian. They're able to adapt. Geographically isolated strategic units refers to kind of what we talked about earlier, where India views the subcontinent as most of its world and is largely content with that, and it sees the subcontinent as separate from the rest of the world, similar to how Americans saw the New World as separate from the Old World. The sense of entitlement refers to India seeing itself as the leading South Asian power, and more with the next category, the decolonization and non-alignment, less as a hegemonic power, but more as just a regional leader through its virtues. And then the last one is the maritime component of preeminence. Because South Asia is a predominantly maritime environment, in order to be the regional leader, India will have to employ sea assets to do so. And just as a note, the Monroe Doctrine has been referenced by Indian strategists, especially in the early period of independence, as a way of discouraging foreign powers from getting involved in their region. And this is just a side-by-side map of the Indian Ocean on the one side and the Caribbean Sea, to kind of highlight how India and its immediate environment does not face any threats from other major powers, similarly to the United States and the Caribbean Sea. So it is a similar strategic environment. Holmes provides 3 different iterations of the Monroe Doctrine that India could follow. The first is a free rider stance, which comes from James Monroe's time as president, and it largely relies on outside powers to secure the sea lines of communications and requires a minimal fleet. So this is actually India's current fleet structure, and it allows for anti-piracy and counter-terror operations with some humanitarian aid, but it does not have the capability of denying another great power rival access to the Indian Ocean. The next iteration is the Constable, which is based on the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt and his view of the Monroe Doctrine. This is largely defensive in nature, but it asserts regional preeminence. So the fleet structure with this would be multiple aircraft carriers that would enable India to fight a defensive conflict and deny another great power competitor access to the Indian Ocean if necessary, but it does not claim hegemonic power over the Indian Ocean region. Under this fleet structure, India would still allow navies like the United States to operate within the Indian Ocean, but would be wary of possible rivals like the Chinese Navy and maybe a little more aggressive in blocking countries who were trying to pursue policies against their interests. And then the last one is the Strongman Fleet, which is based on Grover Cleveland. And this is much more aggressive towards outside powers and has the potential to be offensive. So Holmes estimates this would be about a 9 to 10 carrier fleet. And this would provide India with the ability to deny access to the Indian Ocean region as a whole to any other peer competitor, in addition to projecting power into the Pacific, the Mediterranean, or the Atlantic as it needed. So this would give them surge capabilities. And just to summarize the last two sections together, India naturally will fall somewhere within the free rider to constable range. The strongman fleet is possible given its growing resources, population, and geographic size. And that's going to be kind of leading into the theme for this next section, which is for U.S. national security interests, the development of a strongman fleet by India would represent a serious impediment to our own ability to operate. And so the question becomes, what can the U.S. do to both ensure that India and America remain strategic partners, but also avoid the building of the strongman fleet to begin with? So for the United States, it's imperative that it maintains access to the Indian Ocean region, that it protects the commerce that traverses it and ensures freedom of navigation rights, and that it keeps India a cooperative partner in the region and avoids the strongman fleet. So those are the key issues at stake. And to do this, there are areas of cooperation that are already underway that could be both improved on and continued. The first is arms sales. For the first time, the United States has passed Russia as India's number one seller of arms, specifically anti-ship missiles was the most recent one, I believe. The United States has been doing joint exercises with India over the past few years. And this picture here is from the Malabar 15 naval exercise. There are also planned patrols in the South China Sea of a joint U.S.-Indian Navy presence there. So there's an example of them working together on regional issues. There's been cooperation on counterterror and Indian activity on counterterror using its Navy in the region. And similarly, counter-piracy is one of the main activities that India's Navy is currently doing and would continue to do. And the last one is disaster relief. So these are all areas where U.S. policy should be increased, and it provides the service-to-service contact that will enable the relationship to continue to grow in a healthy and productive manner. So there are two, this is in the broad sense, there are two strategies that the U.S. could employ towards the Indian Ocean region as a whole. The first falls under the category of forward deployment. And this would be maintaining kind of a permanent deployment of forces to the Indian Ocean region and more cooperation, joint exercises, joint operations, and things of that manner. And that requires the maintenance of the U.S. fleet in the region, but it keeps the U.S. involved in the day-to-day power structure and operations as they happen. Offshore balancing is a strategy that's been promoted by several people, and there are different variations to it, but predominantly what it means is withdrawing from the region and reducing our force structure that would help us save on the resources of maintaining the Navy that you would need to forward deploy. The problem with offshore balancing is that it takes the U.S. out of the day-to-day operations within the Indian Ocean and from the Indians' perspective, it would make them feel a little more vulnerable. So if China increased its activity or things of this nature, the United States couldn't be there to assist. And I said earlier that India would probably fall naturally between the free rider and the constable. If it felt that it was completely exposed at sea and that it was living in a somewhat chaotic region, it may then move towards the strongman approach, because that would be its best bet at ensuring that its interests could be pursued. And this is just to cap. So the best way to keep India cooperative and its navy moderate is to maintain an active presence in the region, because once the strongman fleet is built, it could change the Indians' intentions. So what could be a cooperative relationship, once they have the ability to project that degree of force, all it would take would be a shift in policy for them to, say, exclude the United States from the Indian Ocean or deny us access if we were going to pursue a policy that they disagreed with. So for the United States perspective, if they're in the free rider or the constable fleet structure, they would still rely on us for a great deal of their security. And that's the best way to ensure that the strategic partnership stays cooperative. And that's the talk. And now I'll open it up for any questions. Yes.
So you talked about those choke points the British used. If the Indian Navy wanted to themselves use have a navy kind of secure those choke points, how many ships would they have to lead?
That would depend on who they were trying to deny it from. The estimate, because it would be a combined submarine. So there's two ways of doing it. One is with the use of submarines, which is largely just attacking commerce, and they are building their submarine capabilities. They won't have the ability to shut down commerce or deny access for some time. They'll need a larger fleet structure, but it just depends. You need a fleet capable of repelling the largest one that your adversary would send to block you back out of it, basically. So it's hard to give a number. Yes, sir.
You didn't mention Diego Garcia. Were you implying that India would ever have the power to kick the U.S. out of Diego Garcia?
Not in the short term. Possibly in the long term. It's hard to estimate with that, and there are many factors, especially with long-term projections. There's a lot that would go into that. Not for the next several decades, no. And if the United States maintained its force projections in the region, then it may never have that capability, as long as the U.S. Navy could surge aircraft carriers. So, no, that was, that it's something that wasn't directly touched on, but it is in the forward deployed Navy that I argue for, that the U.S. should maintain both its presence and pretty much a constant fleet rotation around Diego Garcia. So, yes, sir.
I must commend you for your work. Great job.
Thank you.
Being from India myself, I understand the way you explained it. But I understand that India would stay between the free rider and the constable role. And I also realize that India does become, they don't have the resources, and several decades down the road, it may change. Because they've always exerted somewhat of an independence. And in fact, even the Prime Minister, when he spoke to the Congress, had said, give us the independence to make our own decisions. So they do exert that factor, which I correctly agree with you on that. But I think there could be a good strategic partnership between the United States and India, because we need to create jobs and build ships, because India cannot have the resources. So I think there is an opportunity for us to do far more there. But again, good job on that.
Thank you.
So really.
Yes, sir.
What potential do you see for China to occupy islands in the Indian Ocean to the same effect they have in the South China Sea to restrict India's influence and power projection? That
is a possibility. There are, near the Strait of Malacca, especially in Thailand, there are areas, and there are friendly ports that China could use as both listening posts and bases. So that is a concern, and I believe that is India's primary concern with the Chinese Navy, is that what is currently happening in the South China Sea would happen in the Indian Ocean, and that would be a direct threat to Indian maritime interests. So it's a possibility, and that's part of the reason that India is increasing its capabilities, is to be able to counter any kind of move like that in its region. And later, if it continues with its fleet development, it may have the ability to entirely block such a move. But that, again, it's hard to predict exactly, but they would also probably look to that strategic partner with the United States for both diplomatic and military help in that instance.
And in fact, the Chinese were setting up a base in Sri Lanka, and when the new prime minister came, his main aim was to eradicate those bases in Sri Lanka because the Chinese was the main concern for them. Would you agree with that? That was one reason why he just wanted to eradicate the zone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so.
Have those bases been dismantled, or what's the status of those? Because this is part of a long-term Chinese string of pearls strategy, and where does that stand?
Prime Minister Modi asked Sri Sena government to find a way to push the Chinese out from the north part of Sri Lanka. So there's been no development done in that area. And the same thing is Gwadar port, which the Chinese took over in Pakistan, has been a big issue for the Indians. But that's the reason the Balochs have been advised to rise up against the Chinese and Pakistanis.
Yes.
You mentioned energy, and I'm just wondering how much of a factor that would be in the size of the fleet that India would want to have. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. India is estimated to import 90% of its crude oil in the coming years. So that is going to be its main thing. Again, the resources needed are more from its production. So the energy is essential to maintain the production that will enable the ships to be built to protect the energy. So that's the kind of circle that exists in. Yes.
I apologize. You may have already put this up, but I'm just going to ask you real quick. Could you give a percentage of the national GDP that India contributes to defense?
I don't have that in front of me, and I wouldn't want to give you a wrong number. So I can get back to you after.
I can look it up as well. I didn't know.
Yes, ma'am.
What is the current relationship between India and Russia?
It's Russia for a long time was India's #1 arms supplier. That has shifted recently with the U.S. surpassing them. They still have close relations. India's one nuclear-powered attack submarine is actually leased from the Russians. So they still have, and that's a carryover. They leaned towards the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So that's a little bit of a carryover from that. But I think moving forward, they see more potential with the United States as like a strategic partner, but there's no reason to think that India and Russia would suffer any kind of a falling out. Yes, sir.
China has deployed their first aircraft carrier. I think they're working on their second. And there have been some incidents recently between China and the U.S. Intercepting aircraft and so on. So how confident is India on the support of the U.S. in any such matters?
I think that's a big motivation for the ties becoming closer. India, because the U.S. and India haven't been very close historically, they would like to change that. So the fear of Chinese activity in the Indian Ocean is part of what's driving them towards the U.S. in the short term, because they don't have a fleet structure to contend with it themselves. So I would imagine that relations between the United States and India will get closer in the short term, especially as India looks to the U.S. to help fill that security gap that it does have.
And the other thing is, India is the only one to really counter the threat of the growing Chinese influence in the South China Sea and other places, because of the way the whole map, the way you laid it out was fantastic. So that's the reason why it's good in their best interest to strategically partner with India. But also the previous threat that came from India to India was from Pakistan, was from the sea. When those terrorists came, they came from sea into Mumbai, and that's when they took over. So that's the other reason why India is looking at having the latest technology from the United States to protect its sea access.
Exactly, and counterterrorism is one of the probably the best opportunities for India and the United States to work together in the short term as well, exactly on that threat. Yes, ma'am.
Resources for building the Navy. What are the chances that this strategy would outlive the Modi government?
I actually believe that it will. I think that India faces a strategic environment that they are going to pursue sea power to secure their energy, specifically their energy trade, and then also play the leading role in the region that it would like to. And I don't believe that that is unique to the Modi government. I think this is going to be a long-term Indian strategy, most likely, short of something that really takes it away. But I think with all likelihood, it'll probably continue into the future. Yes, Dr. Owens.
Yeah, just an anecdote that really kind of supports what you're talking about here. When I was at the teaching the Naval War College, I took a course on sea power and maritime strategy. And one of my students was he was an Indian captain, one of the very best international students I've ever had. And he did something similar. And one of the things he did was he explained the difficulty that India has had in deploying towards the sea, put it in historical context, just like you did, which is to say that India has a maritime tradition, dating back 5 centuries. But in modern times, it is what he called a torn state. And that is that it has a maritime frontier, and it has the resources and the capability to reach into the sea, but because of its landward continental view, it has not done that. And I always use an example of the way Great Britain approached France during its 300 years, which was to keep them occupied on the continent so they would put those resources into the Navy. I think that, certainly India seems to be extremely concerned, as it should be, with China and with Pakistan. But I think that, there's this perhaps cultural, structural sort of obstacle for India really turning its full attention to the sea.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think what you said is true, that the real opportunity we have there is to draw them into the sea with our strategic engagement and the like.
Mm-hmm.
So what a question, that was just a comment.
Thank you.
To build on what you said, sir, India is looking to develop its blue economy, and also it needs to expand its influence. That's what the Modi mindset is. And to answer your question, this will continue if it creates jobs, and that's the reason why it's important for us to tie up with India, to make it India momentum they have built, to that create job acquisition. Because if I'm correct, we don't build any more ships in the Harpoon armed forces ships, but we don't do anything else. If we can do it with India, I think it helps both nations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that fits in. India is very interested in domestically producing a lot of its nuclear attack submarines will be domestically produced in addition to various destroyer classes, and their ballistic missile submarines are also going to be domestically produced. So absolutely. Anyone? Yes, Dr. Lenchowski.
I wanted to ask you, James, if you've had a chance to study at all the questions of how of foreign influence in India. And what kind of an effect that may have on Indian attitudes and strategic thinking. During the Cold War, the Soviets spent more money on anti-American and anti-Western propaganda in the Indian subcontinent than any other place in the world. And it was designed to separate the world's oldest democracy, us, from the world's largest democracy, India, in a way that was remarkably effective, actually. And I'm just, there's obviously been a quarter century has passed since all of that, but I don't know the degree to which the Russians have had, have tried to maintain their own influence in India in a way that by doing it in this sort of way. And also the Chinese have had influence operations in lots of parts of the world, and I don't know that they particularly have a comparative advantage in influencing India, but I'm just wondering whether they have been trying to do that, and whether India has, let's say, shed some of the former anti-Americanism that used to be there? I perceive that it has, because of all sorts of reasons: trade relationships, technology relationships, Indian immigration to the United States, all sorts of things like that. But I'm wondering if you have any reflections upon this.
I haven't done any research on Russian or Chinese influence operations in India. Certainly 20 years ago, if a poll was conducted in India, the view of the United States and especially U.S. Involvement would have come out negative against us. The most recent Pew research shows that the majority of Indians actually view the United States favorably today, and that has been attributed to the cultural engagement that is increasing both among academia and the populations themselves, the service-to-service interaction that the U.S. Navy has had with the Indian Navy and stuff like that. And I believe that trend will most likely continue. But from a Russian or a Chinese perspective, that is an area that they may pursue in pursuit of their interests. So that might be the next area of research for this. Thank you.
This is a question. Do you have a sense of, you mentioned the Indian Navy approaching chartered ships. Do you have just a general breakdown of what that constitutes? I mean, perimeter surface ships.
Mm-hmm.
And how many attack submarines, one ballistic missile sub?
They have one ballistic missile sub, one nuclear attack submarine. I don't have exact figures on, they have a much larger fleet of diesel subs that they're looking to phase out with nuclear attack submarines over the next 20 years or so. I know they've invested a lot in guided missile destroyer type ships and anti-submarine capabilities in addition to aircraft for anti-submarine. So it seems that they're paying a lot of attention to submarine operations and counter-submarine operations as a broad fleet structure. Yes?
And how's their access to uranium, to fuel? You know, if they're going to go nuclear on subs or aircraft carriers, do they have access?
I haven't done very much research on that. India is a nuclear power, so I'd imagine they probably have some of that.
Wasn't that the gist of the agreement during the Bush administration?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Talking about nuclear power, India has their own nuclear power program, homegrown program, 85 million developed the nuclear weapons. What is their commercial nuclear power program? Are they buying reactors from the Russians? Are they going to expand the program to reduce the imports of crude oil?
I have no details on them buying nuclear technology or material from the Russians. They are very interested in all other alternatives. They're investing heavily in the whole swath of green technology simply to reduce the dependence on crude oil being imported. So they're looking at a very wide variety of alternatives for that exact reason, because they see that as one of their largest strategic weaknesses is their incredible dependence on imported oil. And so that I know for sure they've made a large push for investing in other green technologies. I'm not very clear on their nuclear power capabilities, though.
Could you elaborate and narrow down where do you see the U.S.-India relationship, in your opinion and your reading, going towards, and opportunities for us to build synergies?
Mm-hmm. I think the biggest area is going to be economic through trade and just cultural engagement. I think that most likely the U.S. and India are both going to look to the other as a strategic partner and grow closer because their interests largely overlap, not perfectly, but for the most part. So I would expect their political ties to grow closer, and I would probably expect also in the medium term there to be an increase in economic activity between the two. At sea probably is the best opportunity for the U.S. military to engage with the Indian military through joint operations, training exercises, and the transfer of technology. So those are the key areas I think that there. But I would imagine that over the especially in the short term to the medium term, there's going to be a continuing improvement in ties probably.
Just letting you know that actually the Naval War College for about the last 15 years or so, there's been a big sort of an informal grouping focus on Indian Ocean. So, I mean, this is a very important part of sort of naval engagement, go all the way back to Admiral Spruance when he was president of the War College after the war, was to create this program for international officers. And, that's very important, this whole idea of military engagement. The fact is that, every international officer who comes to Newport is definitely going to be flagged in his Navy, and 40% of them will become chiefs of the Navy. So there's lots of opportunity here, and it's interesting to me that they carved out this one special relationship with India, which indicates to me that the Americans in general, I think the U.S. Navy in particular, is very interested in maintaining close relations with India.
Do you see any innovation and strategy or technology that that goes with building possibly a new navy? That India is undergoing right now.
I think for that they're very interested in, and that's why they're still buying technology from the United States and Russia, is because they don't have the domestic capabilities yet for the kinds of most advanced stuff that they would like to get their hands on. So I think that will probably develop over time as well. Their fleet development is still in its early stages, and it's too early to tell if they're going to be able to maintain their time frames and the fleet they would like to project. So it's still early in the game to see how they would deploy a larger navy, because they don't have it yet and it's not fully modernized. So that will be something that will come out in the coming years as they start to employ more technology and grow their fleet. Then their tactics will start to come out a little more.
How do we deter the Chinese aggression in the South China Sea?
I think the best way to do that is with forward deployed forces that would give a credible military deterrent to Chinese activity, coupled with diplomatic efforts with regional partners and direct engagement with the Chinese themselves. But any strategy of deterrence in the South China Sea is going to necessitate the deployment of credible U.S. Navy forces that could use that option if they needed to. Yes.
Besides the U.S., has India looked to foster more regional partnerships?
Yes. They have done joint exercises with Thailand, Japan, along with the United States, I believe Australia. So independent of its bilateral relationship with the United States, India is improving its sea services and then building its own regional ties with other sea powers in the area. So that is something that they have been doing over the past few years and will probably continue into the near term for sure. Dr. Linchowski.
Can you, on that score, do you have any insight as to India's relations with Burma? The Chinese have been, I think have been trying to build a land route through Burma in order to be able to avoid having to depend upon going through the Strait of Malacca and the other East Indian straits over there. And I believe that President Obama actually went and visited Burma precisely to bolster U.S.-Burmese relations, partly to blunt the Chinese strategic initiative there. And I'm wondering, Indian-Burmese relations have not always been cozy, and I'm wondering whether there has been any positive development there based on common concerns about China.
I'm fuzzy on the details of the specific Indian policies towards Burma. I know just from the general research into their rivalry in the region that China is being very aggressive in trying to improve its ties and influence specifically in Burma, and India is just as interested in kind of blocking that trend. So I know I'm fuzzy on the exact policies, but India is putting a lot of resources and a lot of its influence towards Burma for that exact reason. Yes, sir.
I noticed in your strongman scenario, India would have up to about 10 aircraft carriers. The U.S. only has 11.
In Holmes' book, that's kind of it's a long-term analysis, and that is pretty much the highest a Navy can go. So that would be decades down the line. India sees its region as exceedingly dangerous. It sees the U.S. as a non-credible partner or as a power that goes against its interests, and that would be it. Pretty much building a Navy as big as it can, and then employing it to kind of express its power over the region. So it's a low probability option, and it's not one that would even become possible for several decades. But yeah, that would be, at that point, India would be on par with any other global navy in the world if it were to build such a fleet. No other questions? Thank you all for listening and for coming.